No one likes getting a parking ticket. For most of us, though, it's just an annoyance. But for those who cannot afford to pay,
I was homeless when I got the tickets.
it's a burden that can balloon over time, especially when the state follows up years later trying to collect and tacking on hundreds of dollars in legal fees.
And now I have almost $800 worth of parking tickets that I got 14 years ago. That doesn't seem right.
And the Rose Parades are finally back for the first time since the start of the pandemic. But the Grand Floral Route is going to look a lot different this year. In fact, it's avoiding downtown entirely. The reason? Here's the story. I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. All the ways you can communicate with us right there at the bottom of the screen, and we hope you do communicate with us. You can email us. The address is thestory@kgw.com, or you can use the hashtag TheStoryKGW on Twitter, or leave us a good old-fashioned voicemail. Just call our phone number, 503-226-5090. For most people, getting a parking ticket, and it's annoying, but you pay. Simple as that. But for some, especially the poor, it's just not that easy. And when those tickets don't get paid, the government's tax on fees. Before you know it, a relatively small ticket can really balloon into a major debt. And that's when things really take a turn for the worse. As investigative reporter Kyla Boshi found, state courts rely on a little-known program to recover money owed on unpaid tickets and court fees by garnishing tax refunds. And his reporting found it's a program that unfairly impacts the poor and minorities.
As a painter, Chris Baum has an eye for detail, so you can imagine his surprise when the state of Oregon sent Chris demand letters in March suggesting he'd overlooked some old parking tickets and never paid.
And I'm like, wait a minute, this is 14 years ago. So it didn't make any sense.
Chris doesn't remember getting those 3 parking tickets in downtown Portland. It was more than a decade ago. Over the years, those unpaid tickets ballooned hundreds of dollars after court-imposed fees. The state warned Chris needed to pay right away, or his wages or tax refund could be garnished.
The economy for working people like me, I mean, more than 50% of the population can't afford a $400 emergency, and now I have almost $800 worth of parking tickets that I got 14 years ago. That doesn't seem right.
Chris set up a $73 a month payment plan to avoid garnishment, but it doesn't always work out that way. A KGW investigation found tens of thousands of Oregon taxpayers have had significant amounts of money garnished from their state tax refunds due to a little-known program that allows the state to collect unpaid debts, such as parking tickets or court fees. Each year, the Oregon Judicial Department, the largest user of the state program, collects roughly $8 million in delinquent fines and fees from taxpayers, with little regard for their ability to pay.
I was homeless when I got the tickets.
In March, the state warned Jerome Andre it was garnishing more than $300 from his tax refund to pay off a couple of TriMet tickets he received in 2005.
I didn't remember these tickets.
At the time, Jerome was living on the street and didn't have money for TriMet fare. 17 years later, after finding stability in life, a job, and housing, the state has come looking to collect by garnishing a good chunk of his tax refund.
It's almost like it's set up to keep people in their poverty status and from moving forward.
Elisa Kaplan is director of the Criminal Justice Reform Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School.
If people don't have that full paycheck, if people don't have that full tax refund, they're going to be in trouble, and they're just going to go further into a hole that they can never get out of.
Our reporting found the impact of this program has fallen disproportionately on the poor and minority communities. Over the past 3 years, roughly 1/3 of the tax refunds intercepted in Multnomah County for unpaid tickets or court fees came from just 5 zip codes. They're neighborhoods with some of the lowest median incomes in the county and highest non-white populations.
There's a larger issue, which is people can't pay these and also pay their rent and pay for their children and food and all of that.
The Lewis and Clark law professor argues the system is too heavy-handed and ineffective.
We're spending a ton of money having people chase after these people who haven't paid.
Unpaid parking tickets, court fines, and fees often bounce between private debt collectors and the court for years before tax returns are garnished. In Oregon, this unpaid debt doesn't come off the books for 20 years.
I'd argue that even initially, after a very short amount of time, when we know someone can't pay it, what is the point?
The true cost of collecting court fines and fees is difficult to measure, not only in financial terms, but also the burden for those who owe. The question is it worth it? Going after people for old parking tickets years later by threatening to confiscate their tax refunds.
What can somebody do? You can't. There's nothing you can do.
Kyle joins us now. Kyle, one of the questions is, once the money's collected, who gets it? Does it go to the Department of Revenue or the courts?
Right. In the case of parking or traffic tickets, the money is split. Half the money goes to the state. The other half goes to the law enforcement agency that actually wrote the ticket in the first place.
All right. And reform surrounding court fines and fees been a big issue nationally. What's Oregon doing to address the issue?
Yeah, it is a big issue and one that the Oregon Judicial Department is working to address. I spoke with their spokesperson, who said over the past few years, the court has ended the practice of suspending driver's licenses for unpaid fines. They temporarily paused collections during the pandemic. Now that has since restarted, offered payment plans, and extended the time before accounts are actually sent to collections.
And tell us a little bit about your reporting process. How did you come across this? How did you dig into it?
Yeah, it was interesting. We started getting quite a few complaints from people about really aggressive sounding letters from the Department of Revenue saying, hey, you got to pay up for these old parking tickets. Again, many of which were more than a decade old. They said, this doesn't make sense. I mean, we haven't heard anything, and now all of a sudden they want me to pay right away. That in and of itself was a story. But then when we started digging a little deeper, we found out about this little known program where they garnish tax refunds. And I was curious, well, who's getting these letters? Who's having their tax refund garnished? So I asked for a breakdown from the state by zip code, then used census data to compare that to see who's really being impacted here. And as we pointed out in the story, disproportionately, it's the poor and minority communities.
Very nice. Good to get into the impacts and see the patterns in the data there. Thank you, Kyle, for your reporting on that. Moving on now, we are roughly 2 months away from Portland's Rose Festival parade season, which I think is great news. It's going to be the first time since 2019. The last two were canceled by COVID. But this year, the Grand Floral Parade will not go through downtown. It will stay on the east side, and it's going to be a lot shorter. Why? Well, something interesting happened on the way to planning that marquee parade this year. By the way, it takes place on the morning of June 11th. The thing that happened? Something you may have heard about. Not enough Portland police. As the parade organizers were talking with the city, they were told the Bureau simply does not have enough officers to put along the 4 miles of the traditional route and keep everyone safe. The Rose Festival actually considered hiring their own security, but they didn't have the money. 2 years of no parades and no festivals have left the bank account a bit thin. The Grand Floral typically attracts about 400,000 people. It is a big deal, and it winds from the east side of Portland to the west through downtown Portland, which has had its share of troubles. But a spokesman for the parade insisted danger from shootings or interactions with people living on the street was not a consideration this year. Okay, but in my opinion, the lack of police to staff one of the area's premier events once again exposes the Achilles heel that continues to hobble our recovery. The Grand Floral Parade is a fun and magical event for everyone, no matter your color or your income or your address. Making it shorter and keeping it on the east side probably is a good move for this year. But I can't help but wonder, what will be lost for all the kids and the families who would have been sitting on the curb in downtown Portland, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, watching as those amazing floats and bands pass by? It's true, not every city has a big parade, and it's certainly not required in order to have an amazing life. But it is special. And for decades, Portland was able to figure out how to keep it safe as it wound its way through 4 miles of our city. The fact that it will not happen that way this year shows we are a long ways to go and a long ways away from climbing out of the hole that we are now in. That's my opinion. What do you think? Are parades simply nice distractions, or are they important and necessary moments for cities like ours? And if you do like parades, what's your favorite parade memory? Send me an email. Our address is thestory@kgw.com, or call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090. And by the way, while you're sending those thoughts, let's take a little trip down memory lane. Here's some videos of the Rose Festival parades dating all the way back to the 1920s. Something we found in the KGW vault.
Here's the Queen's float. On it, Queen Sharon with the princesses. We feel that the floats and the Portland Rose Festival Parade are something that you will thrill to as each one of them passes by. Decorated with thousands upon thousands of living flowers. Moving on down the street and out of sight.
Looking now upon the officials as they pass in review, Mayor Terry Schrunk and his family getting a rousing hand from the crowd. Followed by a precision marching band, men in blue, visitors for our Rose Festival festivities. The team of the astronauts was much in evidence in this Junior Rose Festival Parade, of course, with McNiven and White. White, his famous spacewalk of 20 minutes. And there's the capsule that put him there, the United States, the Gemini 4.
It's been almost 2 years since nightly Black Lives Matter protests started in the streets of Portland. Now, the city is taking a closer look at how police use surveillance to monitor those demonstrations, even when there was no criminal activity going on.
You shouldn't have your name, photo, and license plate number in a secret database just because you stood on a corner holding a sign.
When the story continues. Welcome back, and keep sending your questions and comments to the story at kgw.com. I've already seen some coming in about our parking ticket story. Thanks for those. You could also give us a call, leave a voicemail at 503-226-5090. A new city audit criticizes the way Portland police collected and stored surveillance around the racial justice protests in 2020. Auditors say police collected information about protesters who were not connected to any crimes and kept some private information too long. Investigative reporter Evan Watson breaks down the audit, which was sparked by fears of Black Lives Matter protesters.
The concerns that were brought to our attention and that prompted us to do this audit were valid.
Portland auditors reviewed a sample of more than 70 police and criminal intelligence unit reports related to racial justice protests in the summer of 2020. They found photos and videos of protesters that didn't include documentation of criminal activity. Auditor Mary Hall Caballero says that could stifle free speech.
The boundaries need to be set by management of the Bureau, and then they need to help officers understand where the boundaries are.
It's why advocates like Chris Bushick with PDX Privacy are calling for a surveillance ordinance within the city.
And you shouldn't have your name, photo, and license plate number in a secret database just because you stood on a corner holding a sign.
The auditor's office recommends new policies and guidance on which information can be collected, how long that information should be kept in police files, and the public reporting of the Bureau's use of surveillance technology. For the most part, police leaders agree. Chief Chuck Lavelle said new directives on intelligence gathering are under review, and all Bureau members will be trained on the changes. Plus, the Bureau will publish details on how it's using surveillance tech in its annual report. Mayor Ted Wheeler said he will work to enact all 5 of the audit recommendations to support privacy protections of citizens.
But in terms of the information collected during the 2020 protests, there still could be information in the system that shouldn't be there.
There could be, yeah. I don't know if they purged that out of the system or not.
Auditors only looked at a sample of reports related to protests. And as Hall Caballero describes, that could create risks.
They could be pulled over, and the officer pulls up their records in the system and sees, oh, they participated in the Black Lives Matter protests. If they were doing nothing wrong, that information does not need to be considered by an officer during a traffic stop. It also does a real disservice to the officers, because then they are unnecessarily potentially feeling at risk, or a heightened level of risk that they do not need to be dealing with when they're out in the field trying to do their jobs.
Evan Watson joins us now. And Evan, I remember when this was going on, it seemed like there were airplanes up in the sky all the time. And I think I and a lot of people assumed at least one of those belonged to the police. What did you find?
One of those did belong to the police, and the auditors looked into that, and they actually went up in those planes. One of the major concerns was that they were using aircraft to surveil and find that private information, but this audit did find that those concerns were unfounded. That wasn't the case in this.
So they were so high, it was impossible to make out individual license plates or people, that sort of thing?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. And then what did the police who were on the ground, what did they find? What did they collect?
Yeah, so the auditors with this found photos and videos of protesters that weren't linked or weren't described as being involved with criminal activity. They found some photos of license plates and also some saved social media posts that the officers had saved without that special description linking them to any criminal activity, meaning that it shouldn't have been in the database at this time.
All right, that's going to be troubling for some, I think. And I know that you were able to talk one-on-one with the auditor about this report. What was your sense? Was she surprised by some of these findings?
The auditor felt surprised that in all of this, that the officers didn't have much direction throughout all of these protests about what information they should gather, how to gather it, and where to put it after that, which is why they recommended these new guidelines and directives. And then additionally gave me the sense that there's going to need to be follow-up on this to see both what police are doing in the future and how they're purging those records from the past.
All right, very good. And by the way, we want to welcome Evan to our team. Evan joins us from Norfolk, Virginia. He's one of our new investigative reporters, and we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Welcome aboard. You bet. Still ahead, a team at Portland State studied tiny home villages and what makes them successful. We'll dive into that. Plus,
there was a classroom where the kids were stuck, and these boys and the teacher, they went in and they lifted that wall off the children while others pulled them out.
some of you shared your memories from the 1972 Vancouver tornado. We'll hear from a teacher who saw students become heroes when the story continues. We highlight problems and issues here, but we also like to talk about solutions. So let's talk about solutions for Portland's homeless crisis. One big idea is building more tiny home villages. The general concept is an outdoor site with a set of tiny homes for secure individual storage and sleeping quarters, and that they would be clustered around a shared central facility with restrooms and other services. The city already has some, but Commissioner Dan Ryan has promised to build 6 more. They were supposed to open last year, which did not happen, so we'll see when they actually get off the ground. In the meantime, Portland State University just released a big study on how effective these villages are and what makes them successful. One of the biggest takeaways is that people living in the villages, they tend to be pretty happy with the model. 86% say they're satisfied or very satisfied with their pod as a place to live, and a large majority said they're satisfied with their villages and neighborhoods. But whenever a shelter like this opens up, we always do hear from the neighbors who are understandably concerned about living so close to them. Here's what the researchers found out about that.
One of the top concerns that neighbors had before the village opened was the behavior of residents. That was at 44%. And once that the village was actually open, that dropped to 29%. So seeing that the behaviors that they were worried about weren't actually playing out. That said, concerns about increases in trash, a big topic of conversation these days, was still an issue and a concern by neighbors. And
the other question is, how should these villages be run? Well, the study found that most village residents want a share in decision-making for their sites and have a degree of self-governance.
One example would be at the Clackamas County Veterans Village. While it's a managed village, they have an elected community council of villagers who do make decisions within a range. So, for example, should the village have chickens or not would be an example of the kind of things that they decide on. And so building in that is really important. The question of should they be self-governed or not, I think we want to support people who are experiencing homelessness to advocate for themselves.
The study also highlighted places where existing villages have fallen short, including making sure people have enough food to eat.
Just under half of the villagers we surveyed were food insecure, suggesting that while villages are helping some individuals meet their basic needs for food, there's still work that needs to be done to ensure that everyone has access to food.
Researchers also found that existing villages serve a small number of residents who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. Those groups make up 40% of Multnomah County's homeless population, but only 17% of village residents interviewed for the study. We want to remind you about our Hey Help campaign. We're asking you to donate to Cultivate Initiatives. They're a nonprofit based in East Portland that offers various programs to help homeless people enter the workforce and get into housing. They also hold community health clinics. If you'd like to donate, just hold up your phone's camera right now to the QR code there on your screen, or you can go to kgw.com/heyhelp. This is what we call a micro donation drive, so feel free to give any amount, no matter how small or how big. All right, keep sending your questions and comments to the story at kgw.com. When we come back, more stories of heroes from that tornado that hit Vancouver 50 years ago. Last night, we remembered the deadly tornado that hit Vancouver 50 years ago yesterday. Many of you remember that event, and some of you wanted more. For example, Martha Bailey wrote in to say, I had friends who were literally blown out of the gym at Peter S. Ogden Elementary School, where they were gathered for an assembly. She went on, something not mentioned in your story was the help that came from a number of Fort Vancouver High School students. The new high school location across the field from Ogden had only just opened the previous fall. And when the students saw the tornado hit Ogden, they immediately ran over to help. Thanks for writing, Martha. You were not alone in letting us know about that event. Others wrote in as well. And some called, people like Trish Duckett, who taught at the high school and was known as Trish Connor back then.
It was a very hard thing to do and a very wonderful thing to see our students who performed so well.
Even 5 decades later, the memory of that awful day and the heroic actions that followed the tornado moved those who lived through it, like Trish Duckett. After hearing her voicemail, I wanted to talk with her over Zoom.
I had just finished one of my afternoon classes, and I was headed over to the office, which we always did, and this is my prep hour. And they said, oh my God, we have to get everybody to the gym. There's a tornado. And so the teachers, we all, especially those of us that had any CPR or health training, we went right down to the gym.
The tornado was the deadliest ever to hit our region, killing 6 and injuring hundreds more. It left a 9-mile path of destruction in Vancouver. Trish was an English and drama teacher at the school, known by many as Mrs. C. She'll never forget how young men in a PE class at her high school responded when that twister hit.
And they had been out on the practice field, which was between our school and Ogden. And they saw the storm hit Peter S. And he took the students, they're boys from the football team, were most of them. They ran across the open area between the practice field and the school and started helping where they could.
The tornado destroyed the elementary school.
There was a classroom where the kids were stuck. And these boys and the teacher, they went in and they lifted that wall off the children while others pulled them out.
The children were taken to the high school next door where the older kids comforted them.
And the thing that I remember so well is our Fort kids would sit with those children and just help them get over their fright. They were still scared, of course, but they were not alone. They sat there with the students. That was touching for me.
It was touching for others like Glenn Owen as well. He wrote us to say, the Fort Vancouver students became and remain heroes for the whole community of Vancouver that day. Well done, everyone. Well done. Hey, that's the end of our show. Thanks for watching. But remember, the story, our story, that never ends. See you tomorrow.
This is